In this video, we will be looking at energy flow through an ecosystem. Energy flows in one direction in an ecosystem, from the sun to producers to consumers to decomposers. Along the way, energy changes forms from chemical energy in food and is lost to the environment as heat. On the other hand, nutrients are recycled throughout an ecosystem, and they travel between organisms and the environment. So in this case, we're going to look at how energy actually moves through these food chains and how we lose energy, usable energy, as we go from organism to organism. So let's look at a food chain first. A food chain is a series of steps that show how energy is transferred between organisms. Each level or link in a food chain is called a trophic level. So our basic trophic level are producers. Producers are consumed by primary consumers. The secondary consumers consume the primary consumers. Tertiary consumers consume the secondary consumers. And quaternary consumers consume tertiary consumers. So we have both a terrestrial and aquatic food chain shown here to show you some examples of how those different trophic levels might be arranged in different environments. Now notice in both cases, the food chains end at about 5 trophic levels, excluding the decomposers that may be involved. So we will talk about why we don't have food chains that go on for dozens of, say, trophic levels on the next slide. Now, it's important to remember that when you're looking at a food chain, the arrow always points to the consumer that is receiving the energy. So energy from the plant is being passed to the grasshopper. Energy from the grasshopper is being passed to the mouse as it eats it, and so on and so forth. Now, most organisms don't just eat one type of food source, so a food chain doesn't give you the full perspective of the feeding relationships in an ecosystem. For that, you're going to need to look at a food web, which shows the interconnected food chains, and those take into consideration the varied diets of organisms. So in both food chains and food webs, we're again only seeing food chains that have about 5 or less trophic levels. And why exactly is that? It has to do with energy loss. We've learned earlier that chemical reactions are not efficient. As we transform one type of energy into another, some energy is lost as heat. And that energy loss means that as we move up a food chain, less and less of the original energy is available to those top consumers. So in biology, we have a general rule called the rule of 10%. And what that says is only 10% of the energy taken in by an organism is going to be used for growth. That is the energy that is going to be stored in organic compounds and stored in the tissues that build that organism. Because the consumer actually eats the flesh of its prey, it is then gaining the energy from the organic compounds in those tissues. So essentially, only stored energy, only energy found in those organic compounds is going to be passed on to the consumer. So the remaining 90% that isn't used for growth is going to be used to power metabolism or will be lost to the environment either as heat or as waste. So heat, although it is available to the environment, heat does not power our bodies. And so it is essentially lost to the environment and can't be used to power, say, this frog's body. Also, this grasshopper, as it's, say, consuming its plants, it will some of the organic compounds it eats will not be able to be digested and they will be left behind as food waste. Okay, so feces has energy in it and that could be available to decomposers, but it's not going to be available to the frog that is eating the body of the cricket. Now, the 10% rule is a general rule. Not every organism is going to automatically be putting 10% of its energy budget into growth. So for example, a younger organism might devote more of the energy it takes into growth than, say, an older organism would. So in general, it's around 10%, but it's going to vary depending on the organism. So this brings us into mind this idea of an energy budget. Okay, so the energy available to each trophic level is always going to be equal to what's entering, and then it's going to have to equal the amount of energy that is essentially leaving. So let's take a look at this image over here. So here's our trophic level. Okay, let's say that this is a cricket, and that cricket is going to receive 100 calories of energy from the plants that it is eating. Well, as that cricket is surviving and doing its normal metabolic activities, of that 100 calories, 65 are going to be lost as heat. Okay, let's say another 10 of those calories are lost to detritus, so that's food waste. Okay, so feces. Now, what's left then for that cricket would be 25 of the original calories, and that would get stored in the cricket's body as growth, or as it adds new cell to grow its body, or potentially stored in fat tissue or adipose tissue, things like that. So because it is stored in the cricket's body, those 25 calories would then be available to anything that eats that cricket. Okay, so if we add it all up, the energy that comes in is going to equal the energy that comes out. Okay, oops, sorry about that. It's not letting me write the T. Sorry about that. Okay, so just keep that in mind with a budget, okay? So as we move up the food chain, we can see less and less of the original energy is going to be available to those top consumers. So we can represent this as a pyramid of energy, okay, where we are representing and making the size of each level based on the amount of energy available. So this one is a pure 10% rule, even though the example we used before, 25% of that value was put into growth. But this one is a pure 10% rule. So let's say our primary consumers, they're going to take in 10,000 joules of energy. 10% of that is going to be stored as organic compounds in the plant's body, leaving 1,000 joules for the cricket to then consume. The remaining 90%, so the 9,000 joules was used by the plant to power its body, its growth, its reproduction, things like that. Okay? And then as you move up the food chain, we're seeing a decline in the amount of energy that is available. So if you are a top predator at the top of the food chain, okay, you're getting a very small percent of the original energy that was taken in by the organism. So as a result, this snake, this tertiary consumer, is going to have to eat a lot of mice in order to gain enough energy in order to survive, because it's getting less of the original energy taken in. Okay, and that mouse will have to eat several crickets in order to survive to get enough energy. And that cricket will have to eat several plants in order to survive. So energy loss creates this need for consumption to gain enough energy to survive. So other ways we can think about organizing our information about our food chains is to create other pyramids. We have pyramids of numbers, which show basically population size, number of organisms at each trophic level. And we also have pyramids of biomass. So biomass is the dry weight, the dry mass of the organisms at each trophic level. So basically you would have taken the organisms and the dead organisms and dehydrate them, and whatever is left over, those are the organic compounds found in that organism's body after the water has been removed. So with both pyramids of numbers and pyramids of biomass, they don't always have a large base, right? So our pyramid of energy, we always had the most energy at the bottom, and energy declined as we moved up. So it got smaller and smaller towards the top of the food chain. Well, we don't always see that in pyramids of numbers and pyramids of biomass. So we're actually going to look at this image and the image on the next page to understand this. Okay, so let's actually start here. And let's look at this idea that pyramids of energy always have a large base. So whether you're dealing with a terrestrial ecosystem or aquatic ecosystem, the plants are the ones, the autotrophs are the ones that are taking in the most energy. Okay, and because of that 10% rule, we're seeing a decline in energy as we move up the food chain. But numbers and biomass don't always show this. So let's take a look first at numbers, okay? So if we have a grass field, we can see that there would be lots of grass plants, okay, to support fewer rabbits, because there cannot be more rabbits than grass because the rabbits wouldn't be getting enough energy to survive. So there's going to be less rabbits than there are grass. And then the fox, because they're at the top of the food chain, they get even less of the original energy. The ecosystem can support fewer and fewer foxes because they have to eat multiple rabbits in order to survive. So here we can see this nice pyramid shape because we have a lot of producers. But here is an example of a pyramid where we have a very narrow base. Here we have one single oak tree. That one oak tree, okay, can support a lot of, say, aphids, which can support a lot of ladybugs because of the sheer size of that. So numbers doesn't always give you the whole picture. Sometimes it's better to then look at biomass, so that dry mass. So if we looked at the tree, the biomass of the tree is huge, and that is why it can support, okay, multiple aphids, and those aphids can support ladybugs. But again, we're still seeing as we go up the food chain, okay, we're still seeing a decline in biomass because of the idea that the energy available is also declining. But when we look at biomass, especially aquatic biomass, we don't always see that nice pyramid shape, okay? Sometimes we have small bottoms. And this has to do with plankton. Phytoplankton, okay, and there should be an A in there. Sorry about that, a typo. Phytoplankton is so small and reproduces so quickly that it basically, as soon as it gets eaten, or as soon as it reproduces, it can get eaten. So it has trouble building up a very large population. But because of its high reproductive rate, it can support a large number of smaller heterotrophs like zooplankton, like krill and other small crustaceans and things like that can eat it. So that's an example of an aquatic ecosystem that maybe has a narrower base, okay, because of the fact that those producers are being consumed so fast that they never can build up a large biomass or number base. Now, this idea of a decline in energy as you move up the food chain also can create problems, especially with stored chemicals. So there is a problem that's typically caused by humans called biological magnification. And biological magnification is the accumulation of increasingly higher levels of toxins as you move up the food chain. Now, why does this occur? Because chemicals are stored in the fat of animals. So the consumer obtains the chemicals when it eats its prey. Okay, so what we're seeing here is we're seeing a food chain, algae to shrimp, shrimp to cod, cod to seal, seal to polar bears. And what these are representing here is we're seeing essentially a pyramid shape, and that pyramid shape is going to be the energy pyramid. So the bottom, the algae has the most energy, the polar bear is receiving the least because of that 10% rule. But these dots, those dots are going to represent a toxin. So let's say it's mercury in the water, okay? So there's mercury that is on the algae. When the shrimp eat the algae, they're going to gain that mercury on the algae that they eat. But because shrimp have to eat multiple algae in order to get enough energy to survive because of energy loss, okay, they're going to gain more toxins. Now, in this case, the cod is going to have to eat multiple shrimp to gain enough energy to survive. So it's gaining all of the toxins stored in that shrimp's body. And so we're seeing more and more accumulation of toxins. Okay, until we get to the top of the food chain where it's the polar bear, which is essentially accumulating all of the stored toxins from the trophic levels below it, okay, because of this need to eat in order to gain enough energy to survive. Okay, so we're seeing that accumulation. The top predator has gained all the toxins that have accumulated in the multiple organisms it ate. Now here's a real world example of this. I mentioned actually in this that this could be mercury. Mercury is found in aquatic food chains, and as a result, it can be stored in the tissues, and mercury can lead to nervous system damage over time in our top predators, which is why the Food and Drug Administration recommends that you do not eat very much predatory fish, things like tuna, or shark, or things like that, swordfish, because those large predatory fish have a large amount of stored mercury in them. And if you eat them multiple times a week, you're gaining multiple doses of mercury, which can lead to high amounts in your body. Here's another example with DDT. DDT was a pesticide that was used widely until the 1970s. It was used to, say, kill mosquitoes, kill crop pests, and it washed into waterways. And it got stored in the fat of the fish. So as the fish were consumed by increasingly larger fish as it moved up the food chain, we can see that the DDT concentration is accumulating and increasing. Okay, now by the time it got to our predatory birds, the amount of fish they had to consume to get enough energy meant they were consuming large quantities of stored DDT. And DDT caused these, the eggshells of these predatory birds to thin, and so the mama birds were essentially crushing the eggs when they went to incubate them. Okay, and that resulted in a great decline in populations. So much so that the bald eagle, our national bird, became an endangered species due to the effects of DDT. Now, because of this, in the 1970s, DDT was banned in the United States, although it is still used around the world in other countries. It was banned in the United States, and protections were put in place for these predatory birds, such as the bald eagle, and their populations have rebounded, so much so that we can actually see mating pairs of bald eagles in the Princeton area. I encourage you to go outside and go by Carnegie Lake and check out the bald eagles that live near there.